Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm here to talk to you about my Stribog SP9A3 now that I've put 300 rounds plus through it. I'm going to be in particular talking about the ways in which I got this gun to malfunction. Yes, when I was firing those 300 rounds, I was specifically trying to get it to fail. Of course, if I had run it under more ideal conditions, and as we're going to see with more ideal ammunition, I probably would not have gotten the results that I did. But I'm interested in what makes things go wrong. It's easy enough to take any gun and shoot it under ideal conditions and get ideal results. I wanted to see what would happen under less than ideal conditions and what kinds of things you could expect at the worst end of the spectrum. I'm going to go ahead and start by showing you the worst kind of malfunction that I found. Now granted, this is only 300 rounds so far, and so there might be worse things that could show up under different conditions, but this is the worst one that I found. I'm going to take a fully loaded 30-round magazine with Wolf 115 grain military classic steel case ammunition. I'm going to leave the bolt closed to start with. Go ahead and load it in there. Give it a good nice slap. Pull back on the charging handle. Let it go home. Cycle out, and there you can see the malfunction. This is a feeding malfunction. The rounds are not coming into the barrel extension at the right feed angle, and so they get diverted in weird ways. Now, clearing the malfunction is a little bit troublesome. The best way to do it that I found is usually to remove the magazine and then pull back slightly on the charging handle and put your hand underneath the magazine well to catch the round as it falls out. And that is the best way to keep it from falling back into the action and things like that as far as what I found. And like I said, that is the worst malfunction that I found out there. And there was only one other type of malfunction that I found. So the first one was feeding malfunctions, and then the second type of malfunction was failures to lock the bolt back, so last round hold open malfunctions. And those were really the only two types of malfunctions that I could get this thing to produce. And in some ways that's a good thing, but it is going to be concerning to some people. Now let's break that down a little bit and talk about how I got it to fail, because not everybody is going to get this experience, and they're certainly not going to get this experience with all types of ammunition. So in thinking about this, and in thinking about what I'm interested in is how are things going to fail and under what conditions, that's how I like to test things. Thinking about the design of this thing and the history of this thing, historically I know that the Stribog has had problems with its magazines in the past. I used to own an SP9A1. I owned the one with the non-reciprocating charging handle, but it still had the dual recoil rods in it, and frankly I like the gun to a great extent. But the magazines were a bit of an issue. In order to get the magazines to run well, you had to lubricate them in some way, shape, or form. It also greatly helped to sand the follower, and not the whole follower. There was one particular problem. There's the main body of the follower in the magazine, and then there's the little hook at the end that engages the bolt stop tab inside the gun. And the notch between the main body of the follower and that little tab that would come up to interact with the bolt stop, that little notch was a little too rounded out, and it would get caught in the top of the magazine and cause binding issues and all kinds of weird little malfunctions that would happen as a result of that. And so I would basically file out that little nub, and in addition to lubricating the magazine body, take all the guts of the magazine out and then just spray some oil inside of the body. This is something that needs to be specified for some people. When people talk about lubricating a magazine, some people think that they're talking about lubricating the magazine spring, and with certain kinds of malfunctions that can help, but for the most part it doesn't. The main problem with a lot of magazines that have a binding issue is that it's the rounds that are binding against the sides of the magazine. And so in order to prevent that, what you do is you lubricate the sides. So you take all the guts out, including the spring, set that aside, and you spray oil down the actual tube of the magazine body, to get the sides nice and lubricated, and that takes care of most of that problem. And then, like I said, that little notch between the bolt stop tab and the main body of the magazine also needed to be filed down so it didn't cause binding issues. And that's how I got the SP9A1 to run pretty well. Now the magazine feed lips were plastic, and so they were kind of weak, and so I tended to download the magazines to about 25 rounds to prevent any major wear and tear on them and get longer service life out of those magazines, but eventually they would fail if you kept them around long enough. Unfortunately, even with downloading them like that, they didn't last forever, and they would get weak and wobbly, and rounds would start spewing out of them because they wouldn't keep the rounds in properly anymore. That kind of thing would happen. So I knew that there were magazine feed issues in the past, and these new magazines, even though they have the steel reinforced lips, the body is very, very, very similar. And so I'm sitting there looking at it going, you know, I bet you they're still going to have some of those same binding problems. Now I did lubricate these magazines in the manner described, and these have a different follower design that doesn't have the binding problem that the old ones did, but it's still the same basic design, and there are still problems that can occur, as we just saw. So I figured that was probably going to be an issue, and so in order to find a binding problem with a magazine, the best way to do that is to take rounds that are do not have the same lubricity as other rounds. Most guns are made to work with, especially more Western guns, are made to work with brass case ammo. So me, looking for worst case scenario, I picked steel case ammunition that had a fairly thick lacquer coating. That's what this Wolf stuff has. It's a very thick lacquer coating that is on there. But that makes the diameter of these rounds actually just a little bit wider than most of your standard brass ammunition. And so it actually takes up a little bit more space in the magazine, both vertically and side to side. And so if you're going to get a binding type malfunction, it's going to be with ammunition that is like this. Another thing that I was looking at is the general design of the gun. This is a delayed blowback gun, and originally it was designed around basically NATO spec ammunition, which in America would be more or less the equivalent of plus P ammunition. Now for the American market, they made some changes to try to make it run better with non-plus P ammunition, non-NATO spec ammunition. For one thing, they changed the cam angle on the roller system. In the US market, they started putting these out with a 45-degree cam angle. Originally, I think it was like a 30-degree cam angle or something like that, so they definitely widened out that cam angle quite a bit in order to try to get it to run a little bit more easily with American ammunition. But the problem with all delayed type systems and gas systems, anything like that, is that their range of operation, you could say, the differences in types of cartridges that you can load in terms of grain weights and also powder charge is usually much more restrictive with a system like this than with a straight blowback system, for example, or a breech lock recoil system that a lot of handguns have. These systems tend to be a little bit more sensitive, especially to loads that are outside of their normal specification. And given that this thing was originally designed, there's been modifications to it. Now, like I said, they have that 45-degree cam angle in there. But originally it was designed for fairly high pressure, so I figured that if I get a low enough pressure round in it, I'm probably going to start seeing some problems. And again, this Wolf ammunition, Wolf will have a few different kinds of ammunition because technically they're more of a distributor. They're not actually the company that makes the ammo, they're just the distributor for the ammo. But this particular kind, the military classic with the thick lacquer coating, is a fairly weak 9mm load. And I was also testing some of the Blazer brass ammunition. I had both the 115 and the 124 grain out there. And with both kinds of ammunition, both of them have a reputation for being a little bit weak. And with both of them, I got failures to lock the bolt back on last round fired. Now, I didn't have that with all of the magazines. I have 3 magazines that I was testing, numbered 1, 2, and 3. Really inventive naming, right? And in magazine 1 and in magazine 3, in 1 and 3, I got failures to lock the bolt back sometimes. It wouldn't be all the time. But with that ammunition, like I said, which is at the weaker end of the spectrum, I would get failures to lock the bolt back, which is what I figured. Being a delayed blowback gun, its window of operation is going to be a little bit narrower than on this thing's direct blowback cousins. So that was fairly predictable. I expected that to happen. And then And like I said, it happened with 2 out of the 3 magazines. Does that mean that that's going to be the case with all of the Stribog magazines? I don't know, because I only have a sample of 3 magazines to work with in one gun. So this is limited testing, obviously, but I can only extrapolate from the data that I have, and the data that I have says that 2 out of the 3 magazines with weak loads, you could get failures to lock the bolt back. So that is what it is. But I don't particularly think that that is so much a magazine issue. Yes, I did only get it to happen with 2 out of the 3 magazines, but it's not like I sat there, it's not like all 300 rounds were just, in that, I just, only loaded like 2-round magazines and did all of my 300 rounds that way. No, it was as I was going through, and I did do a few specific tests where I took it down to just 2 or 3 rounds a few times, but that was like literally just a few times that I did that with each magazine. A couple of times with 2 rounds and a couple of times with 3 rounds. I think one more time with 2 rounds in the magazine, just testing the last few as they would come up to see if I would get the bolt to lock back. Did that a few times, but that certainly wasn't all 300 rounds. That was like less than 20 rounds that I was actually doing specific last round malfunction testing with. So it's possible that the magazine that didn't, number 2, could have, if I had continued testing, wound up getting me last round bolt hold open issues as well. I think that was just a matter of sample size and the testing. So I don't think that it's necessarily unusual in the case of being bad magazines, because 2 out of 3 bad magazines would be kind of weird. You'd hope that would not be the failure rate, or something coming from the factory as being good to go. I think that was just a case of low power ammunition, didn't fully cycle the action, therefore you didn't get lock back all the time. Okay, that happens. If you pick weak ammunition, and if you get weak enough, eventually you're going to fall out of the range of operation that gun is meant for, or designed for, or can handle, and yeah, you're going to get problems. So that wasn't overly concerning. And me, I'm an AK guy. I don't have last round hold open anyways for AKs, and so last round hold open for me isn't a particularly big deal. It's annoying that it is inconsistent, that sometimes it locks back and sometimes it doesn't, because that messes up how you do the reload, or at least can mess up how you do the reload. And so that is a little bit concerning, just the inconsistency of it. But on the whole, being an AK guy, not usually having last round hold open, not a big deal for me. But the malfunction that we just saw, where I stuck the magazine in there, cycled the action a couple of times, and got a misfeed, that concerned me much more. And that was only with one particular magazine that I could get it to do that with. And that was magazine number 3. Magazine number 3 produced that result. And it did it with the steel case ammunition that I just showed you. And it would sometimes do it with the Blazer Brass, but not nearly as repeatedly. With the Wolf, I can get it to do it pretty much every time. Cycle it 1, 2, maybe 3 times, and somewhere in those first 3 rounds or so, you'll get a misfeed. With the Blazer ammunition, the Blazer Brass, it wouldn't happen as often, but it would happen. And just as evidence of that, let me show you one of the times that it misfed. These are 2 different Blazer rounds, but they're out of the same box. And you should be able to notice that one is a little bit shorter than the other. This one is, and that's because one of the times that it misfed, it got jammed into the breech of the gun, not into the chamber, but into the side, and it pushed the bullet back into the casing, which is not a good thing, and that can create overpressure situations and whatnot. Now, given that it's Blazer Brass, and Blazer Brass is not usually loaded to a super high level to begin with, you might be able to get away with shooting it, but I wouldn't recommend it. And you'll see I have it here, I didn't shoot it. But just as a proof that yes, I did have a problem feeding that ammunition, at least at one point. It wasn't as consistent with the brass case, but it did happen. And I'm pretty sure that this one is definitely magazine related, because out of the magazines that were there, this is the one that definitely gave me the most problems. And you can even see here that that round that's at the top is kind of loosey-goosey in there. It's just not feeding consistently. And so this is probably a bad magazine, but again, extrapolating from what I do have, does that mean that 1 out of 3 magazines from the factory is going to cause problems like this one? Well, at least depending on the ammunition that you have in it, it definitely seems to be worse with this thickly coated steel case stuff. It very well could be the case. Now that being said, bad magazine causes feeding malfunctions, but only under specific conditions. For some reason, it seems to show up more often when I start with the bolt closed. If I start with the bolt open, it didn't seem to have that problem nearly as often. Significantly reduced, maybe like 1/10 of what it was when I started with the bolt closed for whatever reason. In addition to that, the main thing that I found that helped is downloading the magazine. If I downloaded the magazine to 25 rounds instead of 30 rounds, never had the problem. It just completely went away. And the feeding errors with both the Blazer Brass and this Wolf stuff became a non-issue. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just taking off the top 5 rounds, and then from here, having taken 5 rounds out and downloaded it to 25, then from here this magazine would be perfectly good. Now, like I said, I specifically went out and picked the ammunition types that I had that I figured would give me the worst results. They're both low-powered ammunitions, and one of them tends to not have the same lubricity as lots of the brass case ammunition does. Also tends to be a little bit wider, so it tends to cause more binding issues. And lo and behold, that was the one that I had the most problems with. Go figure. So this should not be taken to say that every single load that you load in your Stribog SP9A3 is going to cause problems. I'm just showing you under what conditions you're most likely to get those problems. Okay, so weak loads and rounds that tend to be kind of sticky, so to speak, are going to be more of a problem than not. If you lubricate the magazines, and also if you lubricate the rounds, if you don't know how to do that, there are other videos out there that talk about that, significantly reduced. Picking higher power ammunition is going to be better than picking low power ammunition, of course, so on and so forth. Now, what does that mean for the average American shooter? Well, lots of people who buy these guns, these SP9A3s, they get them for more or less recreational purposes. And as a recreational gun, the kinds of malfunctions that I talked about here are things that are mitigatable. For example, the feeding malfunction that I showed you, download the magazine by 5 rounds, so you have 25 instead of 30, and the problem goes away completely. For a plinking gun, loading it with 25 rounds instead of 30, it's annoying. The gun is made, well, the magazine is made to hold 30 rounds, and now you can't, at least not if you want to avoid the feeding problem. But for a plinking gun, that's livable. It's not ideal, but it's livable. And also with regard to the whole last round bolt open issue, again, for a plinking gun, if your life doesn't depend on it, your reload technique or changes in your reloading technique, etc., are not going to be as critical of an issue, and you can get away with a lot more there. So for me, I kind of put the SP9A3 in the plinking gun category. This would not be my first choice for, say, self-defense, and it's probably not going to be high on my list for competitive shooting either. And in terms of competitive shooting, that last round bolt hole open issue becomes more of an issue, because in a competitive shooting circle scenario, you want to have consistency in how you do things. Your magazine changes should be relatively consistent, and hopefully you would pick a gun that you can do relatively fast magazine changes. And if you have a gun that consistently locks back and you do your reloads from the lock back, that's usually pretty fast. Now, of course, if you're preemptively changing out magazines before you run out and that kind of thing, that greatly helps things. But still, it's nice that if the gun runs dry, you have one standard procedure that you follow that always works. With this gun, because it doesn't always lock back, you're not going to get that, so it wouldn't be as ideal in a competitive shooting environment. And also, because I can only load up the magazines to 25 rounds instead of 30, that's also going to handicap you a little bit in terms of a competitive shooting environment. Generally, having more rounds available at each given point is usually a little bit better. Would 25 versus 30 be absolutely prohibitive? Depending on the particular competition, maybe not, but it would still be problematic. So yeah, as it is right now, with the kind of ammunition that I was using, which was admittedly not ideal, I would not consider it to be anywhere close to self-defense type reliability, and probably not good for a competitive shooting environment as is, at least. But for a plinking gun, I think it's perfectly sufficient for that. And that's actually what this gun is replacing in my collection. I sold my Palmetto State Armory AKV. Those of you who followed my channel for a while know that I was not overly impressed with a particular gun that I got. It had some problems with malfunctions again. Some of them would be feeding malfunctions, but one of the things that bugged me the most about it is I would also get light primer strikes. And that is one of the malfunction types that really bugs me a lot, even for a plinking gun. Light primer strikes really tick me off. Last round bolt hole open not working on a plinking gun, not a big deal in my opinion. And if I have to download the magazines to 25 rounds for plinking purposes, not a big deal. But light primer strikes and things like that, that concerns me quite a bit more. Or if I have feeding problems that are kind of in the middle of the magazine that you can't really get around, that also concerns me. And that gun had those kinds of problems. So this is a significant improvement over that specific gun. I'm not saying that all AKVs are like that, but that particular one that I had was like that, and I just didn't want to deal with it. So I sold it to someone who was willing to deal with the issues and deal with Palmetto State Armory and them fixing it and all that kind of stuff, and it's out of my hair and da da da. So this one is better in that regard, but at least depending on the kind of ammunition that you're running, is not good for terribly serious uses. Now, there are things that some people do to these things to make them a little bit better. One of them is that they will get an entirely different lower on the bottom that will use, like, say, CZ Scorpion magazines or Colt magazines or even Glock magazines, things like that. And they usually do get a little bit better reliability out of those in terms of feeding, and sometimes with regard to lockback, but sometimes not. The big issue with the lockback is the operating mechanism itself. It's delayed blowback. It's going to be pickier in terms of ammo than a direct blowback system is. That's just the way that delayed blowback or gas systems, etc. work. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. And so eventually, if you get to a light enough load, you're going to start causing problems. And that, I don't think, is going to be fixed by getting a different lower, at least not completely. But in terms of feeding problems, the different lowers can help with that. Not all of the lowers that are out there, just to give you guys a fair warning, not all of the lowers that are out there seem to be made as well as others, but that is a possible fix that is out there, and some of the lowers do seem to be made pretty well and seem to in fact work pretty well. But I would suggest that if you want to go that route, definitely make sure you do your research first, and also consider that the reason why a lot of people get the Stribog instead of something like, say, the CZ Scorpion or a lot of the other PC3s, pistol caliber guns with some kind of a third point of contact, the reason why a lot of people get the Stribog versus any of the other ones is cost. This one is relatively inexpensive compared to an equally similarly kitted out CZ Scorpion or something like that. If I talk about having to go and get, say maybe a $200 lower to put on the end of it, as well as going out and getting new magazines to do with it, and some of those lowers don't come completely furnished. You have to get your own grip to put on some of them. Sometimes you have to put your own trigger in them, etc., etc. By the time you're done getting this thing reconfigured with a new lower and all the accoutrements that go on with that, you could just as easily go out and buy a CZ Scorpion, or perhaps, depending on exactly what all you wind up doing with it, you might be able to go out and just get a SIG MPX or something like that. I'm not saying that the SIG MPX is my personal favorite, but a lot of people do like them, and there is a thought there. So where does that put the Stribog SP9A3 in the American market as a whole? I think personally, and this is personal opinion, you guys can think whatever you want to, but I personally think that it was a step backwards for Grand Power. Their blowback version, they've gotten pretty well sorted out as far as getting it to work right, except for the magazine issue was there, but in terms of being able to handle a lot of different types of American ammunition, or ammunition that tends to show up on the American market, because The steel case that I was showing you was not American made, but it shows up in the American market. The SP9A1s, the direct blowback versions, tended to handle different kinds of ammunition much better. This one, though, is picky enough on ammo that I don't think it's going to suit the needs of a lot of the buyers who would be interested in it. A lot of the people who would buy this one want something that's a lower cost alternative than other PC3s, pistol caliber guns with a third point of contact. They want something that's cheaper, and if you want something that's cheaper to buy, you probably want something that's relatively cheap to shoot, and so you want it to be run on pretty much anything that you can find a good deal on, and that's probably not this gun. It will work with a lot of different kinds of ammunition, but as you saw, some of the cheaper ammunition that is out there, it doesn't run so well with. And that is a problem. And to put this in contrast, my SP9A1 would run the Wolf, and it would run the Blazer, and it would hold the bolt back on the last round with those ammunitions. I just didn't fully load the magazine with that one because that would tend to make the feed lips on those plastic magazines wear out faster. Okay, so here I'm still wind up kind of downloading the magazines to be on the safe side, at least with some of the magazines, this one in particular. The others are just fine. Magazines 1 and 2 don't need to be downloaded, but magazine 3 does. Still get kind of the same issue there, or at least the same possible issue there, but you don't have that last round bolt hold open anymore, and so it's kind of a step backwards. It's not as good with as wide a range of ammunition as it needs to be, in my opinion. Does that make sense? All right, so that was the results of my testing. That's the ways that I got it to fail. Fully loaded magazines with low lubricity ammunition that is also fairly weak can cause major problems, and just weak ammunition in general, like the Blazer brass, can cause problems. Take that for what it is. Those are the only kinds of malfunctions that I found. I personally would say that if you want to be able to run a wide array of ammunition more reliably in terms of last round bolt hold open, you're probably better off with the SP9A1. And the steel reinforced magazines, while I do like the fact that they have the steel feed lips, they still can bind, and because of that I would say that they're not really a great improvement over the ones with the plastic feed lips. And this will also be of interest to you guys. We tested this gun with one of the plastic magazines, and it seemed to work just as well as the SP9A1 did with the plastic magazine, so there didn't seem to be a great change there. And we also tried putting the steel feed lip magazine into the SP9A1, and that seemed to work just fine. So the magazines do seem to be interchangeable in both directions, at least in our testing. That's what we found. Me and the other people that were out there. Because the person that I sold my original SP9A1 to, I'm still very much so in contact with and go shooting with them from time to time, and they bring it out and we can compare Stribogs and all that kind of fun stuff. Okay, so those are the results. Feeding malfunctions, if you load the magazines all the way up. If you download them to 25 rounds, doesn't seem to be an issue. And with weaker ammunition, there can be failures to lock the bolt back. Those are the main issues. Does that mean that the gun is in the running for you or not? That's ultimately going to be your choice. For me, I would say that it's okay as a plinker because the main problems either are not all that significant or mitigatable by, like I said, downloading the magazine. So for a plinker, I don't mind it. If you're wanting something for competitive use or for serious self-defense use, I would have a lot more hesitation about using it in those kinds of roles. As far as this one compares to the A1, the A3 versus the A1, I would say that the A1 is going to fit the needs, or at least perceived needs, the demands of the American consumer better than the A3 does. The A1 just has a wider operational envelope. It can work with lower power rounds much better in terms of locking that bolt back, and in that regard I think it is better. Now people will say, well, the A3 has delayed blowback and so it has a softer recoil impulse. Not really. There were 3 people that were out shooting this thing in the course of testing, and well, actually 2 main ones. The other one didn't really shoot this gun in particular that much. So 2 of us that were out there shooting and trading back and forth on the guns, and neither of us noticed any great difference in recoil impulse. And a lot of that is because the cam angle that they have on the version that's made for American ammunition is a 45-degree cam angle, and that's pretty wide. It's not overly aggressive, and it's just not going to create the kind of difference that you would hope for. And even on the NATO spec version, basically, it still was not a great difference. I think it was the VSO gun channel or whatever it's called. Please forgive me if I got that wrong. But they tested the recoil impulse out, and they found a 27% difference between, I think it was the NATO spec version and the original SP9A1 blowback version. And to put that in context, most people cannot feel a difference of 20% reduction or less. So if it's 20% reduction or less, you're probably not going to feel the difference in recoil impulse. They measured it at 27% with, as far as I understand, the original cam angle on the delayed blowback system. This one has been adjusted from there. So this one, in terms of our testing and just feeling it, it didn't seem to be significantly different. This one is a little bit lighter, and because it's delayed blowback, you're going to have like less port pop. If you're someone who shoots suppressed or something like that, that would be an issue. But in terms of a significantly reduced recoil impulse while in semi-auto, not really all that perceptible. If you just want to have a delayed blowback gun, okay, fine. But in terms of, is it a great performance difference from the blowback? It is not. And in terms of malfunctions, both versions had their problems with the Stribog magazines, whether it be the plastic ones or the steel reinforced ones. So to me, it's just more expense, and with really no payoff for it. It is lighter than the A1. I'll give it that. It's lighter by about a half a pound or so. So there is that. It is lighter because of the delayed blowback, but not significantly reduced recoil impulse. It is actually more restrictive in terms of what kind of ammunition you can put in it, just because it needs fairly high power stuff to lock the bolt back, at least if that's important to you. And the binding issue was not completely removed. Like I said, one of the 3 magazines was prone to binding, solvable by downloading to 25 rounds, but the binding issue has not gone away. Whether or not these feed lips will last, we have yet to see. 300 rounds through a gun is not really enough to really test the endurance of a magazine, but we'll see. All right, I beat that horse to death. Thank you very much for your time. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know Him, the one true Savior of humanity. Amen.